Hello. Tonight, we'll be exploring one of history's most delicate professions, the medieval assassin. Though the job title might conjure images of shadowy cloaks and poisoned rings, the reality was stickier and far more likely to end with your head on a spike. Let's begin softly, as most deaths did not. Imagine this. It's the year 1283. The wind smells like mildew and boiled cabbage. The cobbled streets of your village squelch beneath your worn leather boots, and every window shutter seems to creak just a bit too slowly. You are not a trained soldier. You've just been hired to do a very bad thing. You are not a knight. You are a peasant with unusually steady hands and a desperate need for a coin. A man cloaked, of course, approaches you in the back of a tavern and makes an offer. He wants a local baron removed from life, quietly, if possible, brutally, if not, the pay. 2 silver coins now. 3, if the job is done before Sunday's feast. You nod. And so begins your brief, tragic career as an assassin. Belladonna, hemlock, arsenic, if you had noble connections. But unless you had access to an apothecary, and you, Dan, T, your options were limited to garden weeds and bad intentions. Let's pause here, gently, to consider your chances. They are not good. Medieval assassination, unlike what bards and bad plays would have you believe, was rarely a clean affair. A classic. They were surrounded by guards, squires, and overfed hunting dogs with a taste for peasant ankles. You, meanwhile, have a rusty dagger and half a plan. Timeless. Also completely foolish. You skulk through the brush, hoping no one sees you. You think of your soul. You think of what might happen if you miss. You're wearing brown. Everyone wears brown. It is the color of anonymity and dirt. Why? A guard grabs you by the throat before you can even pull your weapon back out. A miracle. But the Baron kneels in prayer, and you hesitate. His back is exposed. His guard is down, and yet, mushrooms that looked edible but weren't. And then there was winter. There were no silenced weapons, no grappling hooks. And poison, ah yes, poison. Let's talk about that. In the 13th century, poisons were mostly made from things that were just slightly more deadly than food. Most medieval assassins, those rare, brave, reckless souls, lasted less than a month on the job, which is hard to do when you smell like goat. To prepare a poison, you'd likely need a mortar and pestle, a recipe. When you are cold and hungry and bleeding in a ditch outside of Rouen, your last thoughts are not of glory or justice. Think of the dagger-wielding zealots during the Crusades, or the politically motivated poisoners of the Italian city-states. Many were caught, tortured, and publicly executed. The few who escaped lived in exile, writing bad poetry and regretting everything. A delivery method: your face has been beaten until it matches the color of the chapel floor. Children throw turnips. Old women weep, though not for you. The executioner sharpens his blade, though not much. It won't need to be sharp. You are too tired to notice the difference. The baron survived, but only just. His men want you dead. The priest wants you forgiven. The baron, he wants to do both in that order. So already you're in trouble. Even if you manage to obtain the right herbs, you'd have to administer them without the target noticing. A successful assassin was often a hunted one, and there were few places to hide in a world where everyone knew the smell of everyone else. Alternatively, you might choose the knife in the rib's root, because noblemen, the kinds worth assassinating, did not walk alone. Let's say you persist. You follow the baron one morning as he rides to the chapel, his entourage trailing behind like armored ducklings. You manage to sneak into the chapel after him. His prayers are louder than yours ever were. You think of your mother, and then you do miss. Your dagger plunges into his shoulder, not his neck, and the scream he lets out is so loud it shakes the stained glass virgin. Your career ends before your name is ever known. Let's pause again. Even if you had succeeded, the timeline was not on your side. Those who made a name for themselves quickly found that name passed on to local bounty boards. Even the forests, which seem inviting in fairy tales, were less than ideal. Wolves, bandits, there's always winter. But perhaps you're thinking, what if I didn't do it for money? What if I had a cause? How noble, how deadly. Cause-driven assassins, those who killed for ideology or revenge, rarely fared better. And yet, there's something strangely romantic about it all, isn't there? The lonely figure in the dark, the whisper of a blade, the silence that follows. But it is not romantic when you are there. They are. Why did I ever agree to this? Let's return to our story, though it's nearly over. Your hands are bound with rough rope. You're paraded through the village square at dawn, half naked and shivering. Your last sight is the sky turning pink. Your last thought is of stew. And so, dear listener, we conclude our first chapter in the art of not surviving as a medieval assassin. It is not a profession for the soft-hearted, nor the hungry, nor the uninformed, but it makes for a lovely bedtime story, don't you think? We'll continue next time with poisons, plots, and perhaps a few assassins who did survive, but wish they hadn't. Until then, sleep well, and maybe avoid shadowy figures in taverns. After the dust settles on your failed dagger attempt, you realize brute force isn't your friend. Instead, you turn to something quieter, something that creeps beneath the skin, unseen: poison. In medieval times, poison was the assassin's dream weapon, at least in theory. But in practice, it was more like a bad recipe that could kill your hopes and your tongue. First, let's talk about what you might have in your grimy little satchel. Poisons of the Middle Ages were often made from plants that looked innocent if you squinted. Belladonna, hemlock, aconite, all part of nature's toxic bouquet. Belladonna, also called deadly nightshade, was particularly popular. The berries looked tempting, but eating them meant dilated pupils, delirium, and an exit from this world you wouldn't want to rush into. You, the assassin, would have to gather these ingredients yourself, meaning long, cautious trips into forests that smell like damp earth and forgotten curses. Once harvested, you'd grind the leaves and berries with a mortar and pestle. And here lies the first problem. Your mortar and pestle is chipped. You don't know the exact dosage, and the plants look very similar to some harmless herbs your grandmother used to sprinkle on stew. So you mix a potion that's either too weak to kill or too strong, and kills the wrong person. Mixing poison was less alchemy and more guesswork. You might try dissolving your brew in wine, hoping your target will sip carefully at a banquet. But nobles were suspicious. They hired tasters. Some even carried their own flasks of vinegar to wash the taste away. Or the target might just be the sort of man who gulped his wine fast and took no prisoners. Imagine sneaking into a lord's feast, your heart pounding, your hands sweaty beneath your cloak. You pour a little into his cup, hoping the liquid isn't noticed, and then he lifts it, smiles, and downs it in one, slapping his cup loudly on the table. You hold your breath. 10 seconds pass. 30. 1 minute. Nothing. The Lord laughs and slaps you on the back. He knows you. Or maybe he's just too drunk to care. Your plan has failed. If you survive this embarrassment, there's a backup plan, the stab. But stabbing with a poisoned blade was as effective as hoping your dagger carried a deadly disease. Poisons rarely transferred from metal to flesh effectively, especially when smeared on a rusty, unsterile weapon. More often than not, the stab wound was just a stab wound, painful, messy, and absolutely not fatal. But why poison at all? Because medieval nobility was not just guarded physically, but also socially. A random peasant sneaking a knife close enough for a clean kill was almost impossible. Yet a cup of tainted wine, a spiked meal, or a sealed letter of poison was easier to deliver. Sometimes assassins even bribed cooks or servants to do the dirty work. Of course, bribing meant trusting people who often had their own agendas. Double crosses were as common as bad teeth. Poisoning also came with an unwanted companion: suspicion. If a noble died suddenly, the local constable investigated. Evidence was hard to find, but rumors swirled. And in a world where justice often meant torture and public execution, suspicion alone could be your death sentence. So, as our assassin, you see that poison is a risky business, full of trial, error, and tragic mistakes. But what about other weapons? The dagger is obvious, the poison uncertain. There were others, but none promising a better chance. After realizing that poison is an unreliable friend, and daggers are more likely to get you caught than your target killed, our medieval assassin might begin to explore other weapons and trickstools that promise a little more subtlety and a little less public embarrassment. First, the hidden blade. You've likely heard of it, a small, razor-sharp knife sewn inside a sleeve or strapped beneath a cloak. And linen in the summer heat that makes your palms sweaty and your hands shaky. Sounds convenient, yes, but imagine trying to plunge a tiny blade into a noble's flesh. When you re-wearing layers of wool, a wrong move and your sleeve catches on a belt buckle, or worse, on the edge of the noble's jerkin. Suddenly, everyone is staring at you. Often, it causes little more than a scratch one that a noble's surgeon might patch up with little fuss. Pulling out the blade quietly was an art in itself. Not ideal. Even if you manage the stealthy draw, the blade's small size limits how deep and lethal your stab can be. But what if you could trick your target into disarming themselves? This leads us to disguise and deception, the assassin's second weapon. Assassins might disguise themselves as servants, beggars, or monks to get close to their marks. The key to success here was blending into the background, not drawing attention, which was often the harder task. Imagine sitting at a crowded feast, pretending to be the fool, juggling or singing a bawdy song. All the while, your eyes flick to the Lord you're meant to kill. It was a dangerous balancing act. Make a scene, and you're caught. Stay invisible, and you might miss your chance. Another tool in the assassin's arsenal was decoys and distractions. Setting traps or creating diversions could give the assassin a chance to strike or escape. Sometimes a flaming barrel might be rolled down a street, drawing guards away from their posts. But these plans required allies, people you had to trust, which was rare when everyone wanted a cut or had their own secrets. And then there was the assassin's most dangerous weapon, patience. Assassinations were rarely rushed affairs. Waiting for months or even years for the perfect moment to strike was part of the job. That meant lurking in the shadows of the target's life, learning their routines, their weaknesses, and their guards' schedules. Imagine standing outside a castle gate through a bitter winter night, shivering beneath your cloak, all for one brief chance at a knife's thrust. But patience was also a curse, because during that time, the assassin was watched, tracked, and hunted in return. In the end, few medieval assassins survived long enough to retire or disappear. Their lives were marked by constant danger, long nights of waiting, and too often a violent, lonely death. But perhaps the most striking thing is this: the medieval assassin wasn't a myth or a ghost. They were real people, stumbling through dangerous jobs with crude tools and fragile plans. They failed more than they succeeded. And for the listener lying in bed right now, that failure makes their stories all the more haunting and strangely comforting. And so, as the moon rises over crumbling castles and quiet villages, we come to the close of our tale. The medieval assassin shouted in shadow, driven by desperation or loyalty, was a figure as fragile as the flickering candlelight that once guided their steps. Their world was not one of grand glory or swift justice, but of slow, creeping failure, of missed chances, trembling hands, poisoned wine that went untouched, and blades too small to pierce the armor of fate. They waited in the cold. They slipped through dark alleys. They wore disguises stitched from hope and fear, always haunted by the certainty of discovery. And yet, their stories endure not because they succeeded, but because they failed so thoroughly. Their failures are lessons whispered across centuries, reminders of a time when survival was uncertain and death was often the only promise. For those of us lying awake tonight, perhaps there is comfort in their struggles. The assassin's tale is a quiet reminder that even the darkest plans, crafted in desperation, rarely play out as imagined. And maybe, just maybe, that is why their stories soothe us. Because in the end, none of us are so different, each of us grappling with uncertainty, risk, and the fragile hope that tomorrow will come. So, close your eyes now, let your breath slow, and remember the shadowed figures who walked before, who tried and failed, and in their failure left us a story to carry softly into sleep. Good night.